Welcome to Successes and Stresses, Plants and People in a Jail Garden. Our presenter tonight is Tony Hall. Tony is a student of many farmers. He's also a teacher and a facilitator of garden programs at Franklin County Jail. Tonight, Tony will be discussing his philosophy on student-centered education, and he will also give us a social permaculture design lesson on finding multiple stakeholders. He'll also share lists of plants that create discussion and learning opportunities in a jail garden, plus a list of plants that they've learned they shouldn't grow and tell us why that is. Just have a couple of slides before we get started. We always want to thank our sponsors. These folks help us put on this conference. We spend a lot of time preparing for it, and they help to cover a lot of our costs ahead of time and during the conference. So if you have a moment, just click through on your program book or on our website and check out their websites and keep them in mind if you happen to need those services or products that they sell. We also like to acknowledge that we are presenting, attending, and hosting this workshop from land that was managed and inhabited before colonization. I am hosting from the center of Massachusetts, which is, or was, Nipmuc Nation. There's a link there if you want to find your native land. It's a pretty cool interactive map that you can zoom in and out and learn all about who was here before we were.
Glad to be here tonight and glad to have all of you here with us. Thanks a lot for showing up. I am going to talk a little bit about successes and stresses. I want to augment that agenda a little bit that was brought forward, but first I want to share with you this picture that I took a couple of weeks ago while the cucumbers were still small of this double rainbow over the fence in the largest garden plot. It's about 40 by 30 at the local jail that I work in. And I just need to move this little box around. Hopefully the work that I do is an embodied form of harm reduction inserted into a system created and perpetuated by settler colonialism. And these acknowledgements inform the workshop and my work on the whole. The land that I work on and the land that I live in was first occupied by people that are called the Pecumtuck, and many other peoples traveled through these areas and lived in the different counties, towns under the Pecumtuck Confederacy. We'd like to stop and acknowledge that. Thank you for being here and thinking about those things with me. So who am I coming to you today? I am the garden program instructor. I'm Tony at the Franklin County Jail in Greenfield, Massachusetts. And I worked in Barre, Massachusetts. I went to school there and studied in Amherst, Mass. I've lived in California and in the southernmost state of Mexico, where I studied as well as taught English and gardening in various capacities in both of those places. Ooh, there I am. And so here is my adjusted agenda. So the social permaculture workshop bit that I wanted to do really requires that we were all in the same place. And since that's not possible for us tonight, I wanted to bring you something a little bit different, the same overall structure of this workshop, but we're going to start talking about the student-centered education, moving on to talk about plants, both why some of them have been really successful and why some of them we don't grow at all or don't grow anymore at the jail that I work in. And then because it's a bit more straightforward to bring up on Zoom, I wanted to talk about a teaching concept that I've been working with called the hierarchy of socially acceptable herbalisms. It's, to me, a pathway to frame herbalism for jail educators. And I also want to fit in there some time to talk about COVID adaptations to the garden program that I'm working with. And I think that's my whole agenda for you. I want to, before we get into student-centered education, give anyone who's here a moment. If you want to unmute yourselves, feel free not to. I understand people are probably doing multiple things, but if anyone right now, I'm going to give like 30 open seconds to unmute yourself and say anything about who you are or why you wanted to come to this workshop.
It sounds like such a worthy thing that you're doing, working at the jail and helping to bring vegetables there.
Great, thanks for sharing.
I'm interested in the prison to productive society pipeline that I think this represents, as opposed to the school to prison pipeline that I hear so much about.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
So I'm right now working and trying to get organic food grown in the prisons and trying to work towards nourishing them on their body, mind, and spirit, because of course we all want them to be released, but we also can at this point in time be working towards creating better food systems in the prisons. And I'm also part of We the World, and on September 19th we are actually having circles of love to surround the prisons for the International Day of Peace. So that's a little bit of here of what I do. So thank you for presenting this.
Definitely. Thank you for your work and for sharing. Would you mind saying just maybe the part of the region that you're working on?
Okay, so I'm in Massachusetts. I'm in Norton, Massachusetts.
Oh, all right, yeah.
But I also am really working across the U.S. And a lot of my work is done in Michigan at this point. I have not really connected anywhere here. I mean, I used to go, well, I was a spiritual advisor to Native circles in the prisons. I've been into Norfolk and Fort Devens and things, you know, and some prisons in New Hampshire years ago. But so I'm trying to go, I try to go across because We the World is global. So, but I'm here in Massachusetts.
Great. Thank you so much for that information. Awesome. And your interest. Great.
You got a couple comments. Do you want me to go ahead and read them, Tony?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Sure. So Nina, she's interested in food access in general, as well as prison reform. And Paul Feenan from High Mowing Seeds is here. He's a regional sales rep and Vermont grower now, and was in education and in particular alternative ed for many years. He is close to Dan Pachok in Washington State and followed and admired his work in Washington State prisons.
Cool. Thank you. I'm going to look forward to learning about that person. Awesome. Cool. Well, one thing that I don't really touch on in my presentation that I just heard brought up that I maybe could just speak on for a minute is the kind of inverse of the school to prison pipeline, being the prison or jail pipeline back into society, into having meaningful like jobs, hobbies, and like living patterns. And so this garden program is very much structured in a way that's around what the students want and what they're seeking as individuals in the moment. And so a lot of times that relates to vocational stuff, both college and just immediate need for a job or immediate desire to sort of change the situation they were in before. So the thing that I would like to mention is just that we work a lot with Greenfield Community College, and we, because of Abra Dresdale, have a really strong connection there, and because of the work of the education directors and the programs directors at the jail. And so we're able to offer GCC classes from the Farm and Food Systems Department inside, taught by professors who work for GCC. And that really, I see it as the biggest gateway to people joining my regularly scheduled classes that have less, you know, societal value to them. But it also is a huge step for so many of the students to say, like, I have this one credit, and now because my bid in jail lasts for another 3 months, I can go get these other credits in this next class. And that partnership, I think, also gave a lot of validity to the program on the whole in its earlier days, because it was very easy for people to see that these were college courses that had, you know, skills and academic value that were relevant to the students who are taking them. And so some of the courses include food preservation taught by Androel, 4-season farming has happened, an organic gardening class taught by Deb Habib, and then Abra Dresdale teaches a food systems course. Cool. So with that all, I'm gonna get back into my presentation here, unless anyone else would like to introduce themselves. Cool. Okay. So student-centered education was something I was kind of drawn to, feeling pretty isolated by the system of education I was raised under in public school. And so the big question that comes out of it to me is, who are the students? And in this case, my students' identities and histories really matter a lot. And some of the really salient identities, you know, that I take into consideration are that they're incarcerated, and then, you know, their race and gender presentation, sometimes their sexual orientation isn't right up front, but is often very salient. And their economic access, their abilities, whether that's learning or access to movement and the use of all their muscles. These things have a lot to do with being a physical garden instructor inside of a jail, because there's a history of many types of oppression being perpetuated through all types of education. And in the system of jail, there's a lot of self kind of, the word I'm looking for is escaping me, but people are not feeling great about themselves while they're inside. And that really comes out through a lot of different actions, but it also comes out really directly. And so I try to keep a lot of those salient identities in mind and how I relate to them. And then there's a lot of kind of invisible things that I've learned as I've done this work, both in Mexico and here in Franklin County. I've learned a lot about people's histories, about the context of the work that we're going to do around that. They already know a lot about the things that I want to talk to them about. So I listed some of the things that I've you know, asked, that people have told me that they've done in the past that really influence how they learn about gardening in my class. And this is a big question for me as a garden educator in a jail, is where do, oh, sorry, typo there, but where do they see themselves inside the food system? Where does each person kind of identify with as an eater, as a producer, as a cook, as a farmer, as someone who's interested in seeds? It's a big way to get an introduction to how the student sees the world of food and where they might want to tap into learning in a garden. And so that often requires just a definition of food systems. So if it's not 5:20 yet, which it's not, I would like to play this short YouTube video. And I think it's going to work because I already loaded it once on my computer. We'll see how that goes. And I like this video because it's a big overview, and it's definitely someone else's words other than mine. Is this going to work well, Christy? Is everything's going to be fine here?
I hope so. Looks good.
Okay, cool. I think so too.
Hello and welcome to Teachings in Education, Student-Centered Learning. This is an instructional approach that places the focus on the students instead of the teacher. So let's begin with the overall goal of student-centered learning. Its mission is to create both independent and responsible learners for the future. Now, there are many positive benefits to using a student-centered classroom model. Research has shown that students learn how to express themselves and articulate their individual ideas. Teachers enjoy using this model because students are engaged in their work and on task. Students are constantly working. That students utilize higher order thinking skills through the inquiry-based learning and problem-solving activities. Also, students get to work at their own pace. Remember, it's the students that drive the lesson, not the teacher. Overall, students learn skills that are transferable and will help them adapt to life in the 21st century workplace. Now, I'll ask, what does a student-centered classroom look like? As school administrators roam the room, they should see students working on assignments as the teacher facilitates. Students are allowed to explore their interests. You may see a student performing an experiment on one of their favorite chemistry topics. Students should be working together as a group and building upon each other's knowledge. Cooperative learning frequently takes place in the classroom. The student and teacher should be working hand in hand to achieve mutual learning goals. Here, it is really a partnership in learning between the teacher and the student. Examples of student work should be found in the classroom. Students' projects are placed around the room, posters are hung on the wall, writing samples are there as well. Students are comfortable using technology in the classroom. Technology is used to help students solve problems, just like in real-world situations. A student-centered classroom is not a quiet place. Students should be debating ideas with one another. Students are given a voice and feel empowered. Teachers do this by providing their students with choice in their assignments. Now, let's finish up with some tips for the classroom.
And I'm going to pause right there because we have a very different classroom than this person's classroom. And it's just going to take me a moment to get out of YouTube here. Thank you. Oh, great. So I like that video. It takes like a couple years of taking classes and really synthesizes them down for me. And what I've done is taken this what it looks like image that they created, and I'll give you a couple seconds here to look at it again. And while you're looking at it, I want to bring up that to me, being a student-centered educator in a jail is just the most important way to be an educator inside the jail, because people are sometimes resistant to learning, whether they're in jail or not. And in the context that they're not really choosing to be in the overall institution that is offering the learning experience, it feels a lot more liberatory to frame my whole educational philosophy around student centering. So you've seen these pictures, and now I've covered them up with my interpretations of how we accomplish these things in the garden. So what student-centered education looks like in the jail garden. So I'm going to start on the left side, and that when students are able to explore their interests, they have a lot of different options in a garden. And, you know, all these different things, typically they all need to be introduced, right? People being able to harvest vegetables is somewhat inherent and natural, but it's also really important to show, you know, the details of how and why. And all these other things on the list over the past few years, I've just seen different individuals gravitate to different subjects. And I start each session, you know, the first 10 minutes, people kind of wander around and take in the sun and see the things they want. And then before I ask for assignments in the garden and who's, you know, this is what I want you to do, I start by saying, is anybody, you know, ready to do a certain project? Is there a certain thing that is what you want to do? And sometimes it's something that I don't think is a great idea, but most of the time it is exactly one of the things on my list. And because they're interested, they're the person to take that on right then without any real stimulation from me other than asking if they're ready to do that. So showing student work in class is different because I don't have an actual classroom for the garden. It's in between the two garden spaces, or in between the garden spaces, we're either sitting on pavement or grass. I'm gonna have a mobile whiteboard. But sometimes in the classrooms, I'm able to post pictures of the garden as the seasons go on. And then there's a scrapbook of the education program that students can, you know, see if a teacher brings it into a classroom. I'll show some pictures later of some handmade, hand-painted plant containers. And this year we're also working on taking these coolers that empty containers come into the jail in a secured way, they're styrofoam coolers, and turning them back into plant pots by cutting drainage holes. And we've been painting them like monocolors so that other students can paint them really nicely with their creative juices flowing. There's a lot of space to do art and time. And so that's a really big way to get their work shown in class, is that if I have containers that are covered in art, as all these people move through the gardens, they see them and are hopefully inspired by the people of the past and to continue that process. And then one of my favorite features of garden class is that every time someone's new, I ask 1 or 2 people to give them a tour. And I like to follow the tour, although sometimes it takes the entire like first 45 minutes of class. So sometimes I just let them go. And it's really great as a way for me to informally kind of understand what the students who've been around for a bit know and don't know about the garden, or what they focus on and are interested in. And then it's also a great way for a new student to see some learning in action from the people who've been in the class for longer. So partnerships with students is kind of, what it's all about. I ask a lot of questions about what we're going to plant. I present like 10 different seed catalogs. I've created kind of like a puzzle system where we have like a square foot garden model and these different sized cutouts. So say, for example, the cucumber plant is going to need 2 by 1. So there's a cutout that is 2 squares by 1 square, and we can design the different raised beds in that fashion. And also that gives an opportunity to talk about companion planting. And it gives people a chance. Then we take them and I tape their symbols onto the paper, and we make photocopies, and they get to see the map of the garden bed that they designed. And typically we enact those beds because they're so well planned out, especially in the spaces that have smaller garden access. So we talk a lot about the future while folks are in jail, when we're not, when we're doing things like tying plants and weeding. And so conversations about future jobs, conversations about how the community college courses have influenced people's seeing of the world, and what community college courses they would like to see next has been really great to get more student input, gets more students. And then we've had an opportunity through Deb Habib was able to find a grant for some books, and she was able to present a catalog of local agriculture, of books in the agriculture section, put together by a local publisher. And a group of students was able to choose a dozen or so books that are now in the library, and that I'm able to refer to and pick up and hand someone a book about the small scale livestock thoughts they had, or the organic medicinal herb farmer has the answer to that question about like how hard it would be to dry lavender. So it's been really great. The students of old chose books, and students of today are still using them. We do a lot of talking about many different ideas in the garden world, companion plants, the ways that we see food systems, which crops to grow how much of in the future, down to very simple and straightforward things that are very specific to the jail, like should you eat raw garlic if you have a bunkmate currently, and how is that person going to react? I've already mentioned the student-led tours as part of cooperative learning, but we also do some kind of small group sessions where people will hand out different pieces of material to different groups, and they'll read it together and report back, so to speak. Typically, people aren't asked to do a task alone unless I know it's something they want to do alone, or it's obvious they want to be alone. And so there's a lot of space for people to learn when they're able to, weed next to each other, water with another person who's also using a hand watering wand who's 2 rows away. And a lot of times when we have problems, which come up pretty consistently in the garden and in the greenhouse, we don't just solve them, and I don't sit alone and think about it, but I bring the questions and find slow, long ways to answer them with a lot of student input. We have a specific kind of erector set style greenhouse that comes with a lot of issues, but was approved by the Department of Corrections. And we are constantly kind of adapting to fit the needs that greenhouse has as a group. So technology, I've had quite a few people who have differing physical abilities, and I've got some tools that help them, a standing bulb planter, as well as like standing weeders. And sometimes that separates people, and sometimes they don't want to use those things, but a lot of times everyone will try it, and a couple of people will use it a couple of times, and it's more about the experience of knowing that they can do the task than being the one who has to do it every single time. So I also bring examples and show videos of tools that are not really right for our size of garden, but to inspire students around, you know, look at these advancements that people are doing in the sector of market gardening or in the sector of, you know, no-till agriculture. And they get to see these things. And I mean, we have a broad fork for the program. And that's been a really great, like, whole set of lessons coming out of one piece of technology. All right, I think that's the end of my section on student-centered education. So I would like to see if anyone has any questions about anything that I just brought up there before we talk about plants. All right. Anybody still trying to click mute, unmute? Okay, all right. Jail gardens can grow anything. Just depends on all the factors of every other garden, right? I think I should say a little more on that. So a lot of times in garden design, we take into factors of bureaucracy, right? If we're working in an urban setting, we have limitations from that. If we're working, trying to do something commercial with a farm, there are so many different layers of bureaucracy to study and understand to make things succeed. And for me, as the first time really coordinating a program inside of a jail or a prison, there's been a lot of navigating the bureaucracy to make sure that the right resources go to the right place at the right time, and that everyone in the security hierarchy is kind of satisfied with how those things go where they need to go. And I guess I bring this up to say that we don't always get to grow the things we want where we want to grow them as jail educators, garden educators, but there's a lot of ways to make relationships with the people who do make those decisions for us, and to start to learn about why they make those decisions, and to then expand our own thinking to find new ways to make our goals happen. I'll go into that more when I start talking about pitfalls. So nasturtium, cucumber, chamomile, and plantain. I thought these were 4 unique plants that I've worked with a lot, that I wanted to go into a little bit about how they've inspired inside of jail gardens. So nasturtiums, a wonderful self-seeding flower. My favorite part is that just people do not believe that this beautiful flower is going to taste spicy like a radish. And then they watch another person eat the flower and they think, I guess I should do that. And you can see them do it, and they do it, and they still can't believe it, and they chew it. And it's just a watershed moment for so many folks. And it also, we've just had so much wonderful success with them growing back because they're so plentiful. They just drop their seeds everywhere. Yeah, wonderful. Now, we are not the only ones who love them. And these are our primary competition because they can squeeze under the chain link fence. And not just for the nasturtiums. These rabbits are the toughest part, but they are nice. Yeah, definitely the toughest pest, I mean to say. So cucumbers for me have been absolutely essential. One thing is that the kitchen at the Franklin County Jail that I work with, they already had a process for, you know, getting whole raw cucumbers through their vendors and having their workers, who are incarcerated people as well as staff, processing them into somewhat regular meals. And so that was a really important pathway to go down, was to find out what they already used that I could grow. And additionally, cucumbers, when we grow them in trellises, have this really great opportunity where people can kind of just choose, like, this is my 6-foot patch, and like, I'm going to uniquely weave these vines in the way that works for me with kind of an unlimited supply of twine. And then they get to eat that crop regularly in the garden, as well as have so much from that crop that they are able to share it with whoever else you're sharing with. And this year we're sharing food out into the community through the reentry team. So that's, I could say a little more about that later, but essentially what it is that the jail employs professional case managers who meet up with people post-release and have conversations with them in video chats in this era, and help them get their different needs met, whether that's meeting with so other social workers or agencies, or also just things that relate to recovery. and things that relate to survival. And so one of those things for us right now is providing produce in shares, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. So chamomile. I'd never grown chamomile before I worked at Franklin County Jail, and it came to me as a request. Like, this is a tea that someone used to buy on commissary at a different facility they were in, and they knew that Sleepy Time tea was made of chamomile. And I thought, well, if you're requesting a specific herb that's very calming, this is a fabulous time for me to learn how to grow it. And as I wrote here, it really, similar to the nasturtiums, it really, people remember Sleepy Time tea for some reason. About half of my students, give or take, seem to have tried it at some point in their life. They find a fond memory of a person who gave it to them. And it's fun because you pick it and it comes back and it comes back again. And we interplant it all over the place. We're lucky enough to have a great relationship with a local community farm, Just Roots. And in June, they just open up their leftover seedlings to us. And so there was a lot of chamomile in the past few years, and we've been really successful with it. We started seeding it this year for the first time, which was really successful again. And it's great because one of my goals, another thing I should say about it is one of my goals is to grow enough of a few herbs to get them brought into the kitchen, turned into tea, and sent out to to all the people who are going to eat the food, because they currently send out juice or a Kool-Aid type drink. And while there are a lot of hurdles there from everybody that I know who works in those positions, for me, the first step was really learning to make sure we could produce enough to make that possible. And so this is step one, and a lot of the students are on board. And in the moment, there's not a way to get any of the crops that we produce directly into the living units. That's something I probably should have led with. So that really influences the way that this garden works, because I don't grow eggplants, because there's no way that the students are really going to use them unless we have nutrition class, which is, again, a COVID adaptation. We don't have nutrition class right now. Yeah, okay, past chamomile, I digress. Plantain. If you're not familiar with plantain, you've probably stepped on it a million times. And if you are, you probably have still stepped on it a million times. This is some information directly from Wikipedia about plantain. And what I like about it is that when people get stung by stinging nettle, which does live in our garden, or get stung by a bee, or when they're really, really itchy and they just don't know why, I get to introduce the idea of a saliva poultice. You know, take this plant, chew it up, and put it on your skin. And it both grosses people out and works. And so that's really cool. And we talk about the different, we run an herbalism class in all the units, usually starting in the late fall to take the harvest, dry it, and then talk about energetics and talk about uses. And so this is just one that kind of pops up in the, can you believe that this is all over the world and has these many different uses? And also it has the name of a different plant that many of us are familiar with, but we just sort of step over this thing all the time. And, you know, bringing it in to the food realm is another piece that kind of makes people sort of step back and say, wait a minute, you put that thing that we've been walking on in our salads? And I say, well, not exactly the same one in the pathway, but we've got them in a different part of the garden that nobody steps on, and you just ate it. Yeah. And folks are impressed by the idea of eating the weeds, I find, in my classes. It's an interesting concept that doesn't really have to do with like stopping invasive species or saving money. It's just it's unbelievable to so many of my students that there are plants that just grow on the ground that could go into the salad mix that looks like the one that's $8 a bag. Okay, so that was successes. That was some 4 plants that I really like to grow or have around and talk about. And I want to pause right there and ask if anyone has questions about those things or about why I didn't include something else. Cherry tomatoes could have made the list, but it's basically the same reasons as cucumber. The kitchen can use them if you grow the hardiest enough varieties that they can kind of sit for a couple of days. And students can take on 1 or 2 plants and really feel like this is the plant that I'm working on. And people love them, and they're easy to eat, and they're already a part of the kitchen's food system. They already order them. So if I can guarantee X number of deliveries, then they can order a little less and integrate them in. So plants not to grow in a jail or prison garden. So there's a couple different reasons, and I want to, separate these by those reasons. So one is that they contain constituents that are not allowed in jails or prisons. So tobacco, we can't have nicotine in there, we can't have cigarettes, we can't have dried tobacco. Ephedra is used for all sorts of reasons to like wake yourself up, and can be abused and can be mixed into other things. Cannabis, which also hemp, we're not growing hemp inside the jail, even if it's legal on the outside. Even if cannabis is legal on the outside, people are not allowed to have controlled substances. Poppies, for the same reason. Regardless of the variety, some people will, attempt to use the medicine in a poppy. And there's a lot of students who are dealing with opiate addiction inside of jails. Blue morning glories contain a constituent that you don't want people having, as well as San Pedro cactus. And so these are really like forward-thinking thoughts. Like, you just don't want to be growing these things so that no one who also knows that they contain certain constituents that will alter their consciousness brings them inside and like ruins the whole program, right? And San Pedro cactus, obviously not a thing that people in Massachusetts are going to grow, but who knows who's going to watch this, so I wanted to include it. So recently, last year, I had to stop growing spicy peppers because it became aware to someone in the security system that that could be processed into a weapon and used against security personnel or against other students or incarcerated people. So that was a big bummer because we had already planted a bunch of jalapenos, and then what I had been doing was jalapenos in the garden where anybody can join, and then as people kind of advanced in the system, we were growing the ones that they really wanted, like the ultra spicy peppers. And all of them had to come out. And so I was able to take them home and pickle them, but haven't received permission yet to bring them back in because I don't have a nutrition class to bring them into. And then totally different from those things is line of sight or access to the roof. And this is not really something I thought about at all, but I proposed using bamboo as a privacy fence to block a 300-gallon water tank and got denied because they really want to be able to see from every angle where the students are at any time. And so a privacy fence is inherently the opposite of that. And on that note, so the fruit trees, I have some fruit trees outside of the perimeter fence within what we call like the microforest garden, which about 14 people at any given time who are incarcerated in a pre-release program, they have access to that garden. Not currently, because that program largely allows people to go out into the community and work all day and then come back to the jail as a transition out of jail. And so because that's not COVID safe, that program doesn't operate right now. And so I've kind of dialed that garden back. So we have some fruit trees there, but within the perimeter fence where the vast majority of the students I work with get to take class, we cannot have trees. Short bushes are okay, but I've been asked not to do high bush blueberries because there's just a fear that folks could use the plant to get onto the roof of the building or for other aspects of escape. So those are important things to avoid. And I think, based on what I've learned, it's not even really worth asking anymore about these things. One solution that I've got to is to, grow tobacco, grow peppers, and then, basically make my own spray on pesticide and approach the security personnel and say, I'd like to do this when no one's around and move that thing back, the bottle of pesticide back to my car, and then tell my students what I did and why they can't participate in it, is a part of the transparency. And so that's worked, so far because I'm growing the things at home. That's all. We'll see if they actually allow me to use them if I have a need. So what about trees? It's a really big bummer. So I did some research and, there are these trees now called columnar apple trees. They're mostly focused. I got the picture, I think, from Rain Tree Nursery. And, they're targeted to people who are in urban environments. As you can see, they're close planting and they have no branches, but they still fruit an amazing amount. I still got denied for some reason recently about these trees, but anyone else who's working in other institutions, I encourage you to see if it works for them. And, I couldn't quite get the exact reason. I think it was basically still about climbing. And so I'm hoping that maybe Rain Tree will come out with a dwarf columnar tree and I'll be able to show the ad to the superintendent or person in security who might change their mind. But I love these as an idea. They look really cool in other pictures. I encourage you to check them out. Okay, so I brought up this COVID-19 adaptations section, but I want to open up for questions about the plants that we don't grow for a couple of seconds, and then I'll talk about some of these things. Cool. So first thing is that the jail population had gone down significantly. So additionally, because of social distancing, my class sizes are just inherently smaller so that people have the opportunity to stay socially distanced in a more concentrated, in a more like organized fashion. And then additionally, there are just less people inside, so there's less interest and time in their relatively busy schedules to take classes. So that's given me a unique opportunity that I've never had, and it's, you know, kind of in some ways what every educator wants, is to be able to have more small group and one-on-one time with students. And it's also just meant that we've been able to get deeper into certain subjects that people are interested in. As all of you are aware, wearing a mask changes everything. I am required to wear a mask at all times when the students are present and when I'm inside a building. And when I'm outside alone working, I cannot wear the mask. And I do wear the mask when I'm outside alone harvesting or processing food that's going to go to anybody. So that's been tremendously difficult because I work, as I mentioned before, the gardens are spread apart on a parking lot. And it's typically by 9:30 or 10 a.m. It's been about 100 degrees when in the parking lot in the garden, when my phone, you know, application says that it's 92 or 87. It gets really hot in that parking lot. And so wearing the mask has forced me to dial back the energy I can put in, and so has slowed my lessons down a lot. A pause to ongoing program development. We were working on a program called Food to Families, project rather, where we're expanding the number of gardens, expanding the space in the gardens, and focusing on a market garden style intensive cropping to create a CSA where the incarcerated people who are working 4 to 5 days a week, 5 to 6 hours a day on this micro farm are able to offer a share of food to their family members or folks in the community that they want to offer that food to. And that program was in full swing, and we were working on it right up until the day that we were told that the staff who were not essential needed to stop coming in. And so we've kind of dialed it back a little bit. And as I spoke about before, there's the prospect of sending the food to more people who are re-entering out of the jail. But other program development, like just more community college classes, interns. I've worked hard to create profiles within the network of college intern websites, and just as we were ready to start looking for summer interns, we found that would not be possible to bring more people from the outside into the jail. But on a positive note, I've asked for a mobile whiteboard, and that's been really fun. It's been really great to draw things, concepts that we don't have the physical capacity to teach. It's been cool to do lessons where there's a lot of vocabulary, and I hadn't thought of that before. And just because there's not as much space in classrooms with whiteboards, and I'm not leading classroom indoor classes, the mobile whiteboard has been great, and I think the students really appreciate it. It adds another level of learning style to my regular kind of presentations with handouts and activities. Questions about COVID-19 adaptations? This is one of our raised bed gardens. As you can see, this is kind of next to that parking lot I was talking about, but one fence away. This is a different unit of the jail, and this is 2 years ago. The zinnias and tomatoes were fabulously flowering. Got some more pictures in here for a few minutes. This is to my right there. You can see me standing next to the orange bucket. To the right of me in that photo is the giant parking lot. And again, some more zinnias. We do a lot of colorful flowers to bring in the pollinators and to really brighten up You can see on the left side of the photo, the gray wall of the unit that most of my students live in or reside in while they're doing time in Franklin County. This is that greenhouse I mentioned before. So you can see, again, the pavement. That's me there looking in on a comfrey plant in a 5-gallon bucket and a lavender plant next to it. And you see to my, to the right of me in the photo is those white styrofoam containers that we're now painting and turning into plant pots. And the institution receives 3 or 4 of those a month. And so that's a really great opportunity because a plant pot that big, like you see the tan one on the right, is a good amount of money. And so getting those every month and painting them has been a really nice boom for the garden program. And we're able to put them in places that have great sun and water access, but where we're not allowed to build a bed for some reason. Maybe they plow snow there, maybe it's over a water line. And so it's been a really great feature and kind of a thing that students invented. I was just using it to hold stuff and they're like, why aren't we growing plants in this? And now a lot of creativity. And you see the pallets, it's an adaptation that a student came up with to cool the plants. And we did some experimenting and kind of sunk the thermometer in the pallet. We put the thermometer out on the ground 10 feet in front of the pallet and put the thermometer amongst the plants and in the plants. And it does do something. It's not a dramatic reduction, but it does reduce the temperature of those plants, which is important because sometimes they get so hot that I fear they're going dormant just from being so warm. Here is an example of those painted, handmade plant pots. So these currently right now are busting with thyme and sage and oregano, but this was the day that they got filled. These women were in Deb Habib's organic gardening class, and they were first, they built the boxes with screws and screw guns, and then they painted them, and then we built the soil ourselves, mixing the different components, put them in, and then we planted a bunch of perennial herbs that Just Roots donated. And I love these boxes. They're so beautiful. And that, again, is another inspiration for us to do the cooler project. Okay, I'm going to go back if it'll let me. Cool. And okay, so any questions about anything that I've covered so far at all? I don't know how many folks are still in here, so I can sort of check that. There's a good number of you. I'm going to give a couple seconds for questions.
You just have some nice comments here, Tony, that they love your collaboration and reflection, really like your approach to teaching.
Great, thank you all. Thanks so much. I feel very blessed to teach in this environment and to have a really supportive set of supervisors and coworkers. The other teachers in my team are really dedicated. They all do kind of like adult basic education or we do a lot of writing inside the Franklin County Jail within the education department. So there's a lot of creative writing, a lot of idea incubation, and then also job preparedness. And feel really supported by that whole team. And I think that's really important to mention. Cool. All right. No questions or comments. Thank you for reading those, Chris. So I started teaching herbalism inside the jail because people wanted it. I would send out a little survey with like 50 different topics that I felt like I could get into as an educator, and then I would rank them, and herbalism always came back as the choice. And so I started, trying to think about, well, where did I start learning these things? How was I introduced to them? And then what is the best way to introduce new people to them? And started thinking that a lot of my students were already pretty versed in some aspects of herbalism. And so I started brainstorming with them, like, what's different about the aspects that you're familiar with from the things that I was taught at UMass or in workshops at something like the NOFA conference. And so we talked about social acceptability and how some behaviors are completely unacceptable by society, and some are somewhere in the middle, and some are the things that we all aspire to, or like the jobs that we think are like the pinnacle, right? And so we created this list, and I by no means created this alone. I've been working on this with probably 8 different classes for now 2 years. And I have pulled these answers and differences out of those groups, and this is evolving. I would not want to publish this to anyone, but I'm very glad to share it for the first time outside of the class. So social acceptability of acceptable herbalisms, right? Like clinical herbalism, medicinal, religious, spiritual, recreational, habitual, unfortunate, and criminal. And many of these words I've adapted based on student input, based on like, well, I don't know if that's quite the right word for that behavior, you know? And so we go back and forth. And so I'm now gonna click and give you a little bit of example. The first thing I wanna draw though is that we've decided that there's a line there between spiritual and recreational, and that there's kind of some kind of break in social acceptability. And some people argued that it might actually, that line might be above spiritual, between religious and spiritual, but some of us have settled, some of the students that I've been working with a while have settled on that for whatever reason. So clinical, I like to say this exact thing when the first time I'm introducing it to a group. An infusion of exactly this much chamomile in this much water, right? We know the details. And then a medicinal form of herbalism. We know that it's gonna work and we know what it's for, right? An example of religious herbalism that we come up with is the Seder plate or communion, right? And so let me step back right there and say, what is herbalism? And that's always my first question before we even go into how people are connected to it. And the definition that I like to use is the human use of something that naturally grows to solve some kind of problem. And so the most, most common ideas of herbalism are that we use plants for medicine. But we've included spirituality and all forms of kind of problem solving, because I think that that draws all these things together. Essentially, when we need medicine, right, we're solving a problem. I choose chamomile because I have a headache or I can't sleep well. I choose ibuprofen because the headache is really, really bad, right? So that also includes like using bone broth. That includes, and then that gets into the bottom of this list. It also includes all these things that many of the students I work with have done in the past to solve a problem that are sort of plant or naturally based in some way. For example, tobacco, right? You see it down here on one of my lists. So I'm gonna continue going through. So an example of spiritual herbalism would be incense or smudges or many different sacraments that people use that they might not call religion, but that they see as a way for themselves to connect with something bigger than them or greater than them. So then we get into recreational herbalism, right? And so is drinking alcohol really herbalism? And I would say yes. And sometimes we can cause problems by solving problems, right? That is one of the greatest things about being human. And solving a problem with alcohol may not be the best choice, but it does work for some people, and it works for a certain amount of time. And the same with tobacco or cannabis or hallucinogens. And maybe the problem that someone's solving with a hallucinogen is that they feel disconnected already and they want to feel more disconnected. Or maybe they want an experience that they don't know how else to get. So I like to reframe the experience of using a plant-based substance in these ways: recreational, habitual, unfortunate, and criminal. And so habitual, I've drawn these kind of spirals here around recreational, habitual, unfortunate, and criminal, because this is what the students really wanted me wanted me to know, is that these things do spiral. They're not stagnant. Some people can have a successful relationship with one substance and a disastrous with another, or it can last for years that they are okay, and then something changes. And, you know, one of the things about being a jail educator is suspending judgment and opinion a lot of the time in order to give people space to share their own experience and share their own opinion. And so, you know, we've gone through what is the right word, but unfortunate uses of herbalism I classify as amphetamines, cocaine, opioids, tobacco, alcohol. It gets really tough for some people, those uses. And then the toughness of solving the problem that they have, say the problem is pain, maybe it's in their heart or maybe it's in a body part, and they use opiates, that causes this directional shift in life to go to criminal behavior. And so I bring that up because so many people that I work with used some kind of problem-solving situation that they needed to do by their estimation. And that resulted in them coming to jail where I met them as their herbalism teacher. So as you see here in examples that I said are processing or distributing cocaine or opioids, right? And so is being a street level crack salesman really herbalism? And I guess where I come into it is, yes, it is. It's criminal herbalism. They have highly processed a plant and they're selling it to folks who want to solve an issue. And that issue is not the same as me needing to sleep and wanting chamomile, or me wanting really good blood pressure and using cordyceps. But it is humans solving an issue because a plant is available to them because other humans figured out how to process it, right? I don't have time to use the valerian that I use in like as a tea, or to like chop it up and put it in a soup. But that tincture that I use when I need help sleeping is really effective for me. And that's similar to someone who has no hope except to smoke some crack, right? It's a different moment in their experience, but it's a similar human desire. And so I bring this all up because I think it's really important to try to get people to think of themselves as capable in a subject that is so kind of both disconnected from our culture and also innately human, that is herbalism, that is healing ourselves, that is getting to a point where we don't have as much need for external satisfaction because we have a relationship with plants in the natural world to try to build something that is more healthy, right? And that's really the commonality between all my students, regardless of the reason they've ended up there. You know, there's a lot of people that I work with don't have a relationship with substances that resulted in them being in jail, but they can still see these cycles and they can find themselves within okay, yeah, I use herbalism spiritually, like that time that we smudged the apartment when we moved in, or you know, it really was unfortunate when I went on that bender on alcohol and that resulted in all these negative problems and my body never recovered, right? There's a lot of ways for folks to integrate their own experience into something that I guess basically that has been reported to me as seeming unattainable to so many of my students. It seems like something you need to shop at Whole Foods and have a degree in order to figure out how to be a part of. And that's not what I thought was going to be the experience of trying to teach a subject like herbalism inside the jail. I didn't expect people to say that to me. But when they started saying, you know, I said, why are you interested and why haven't you learned before? And that's the commonality, is this is not accessible. This doesn't have to do with my life. No one I know knows these things. And from my upbringing, that I don't have those experiences. I was surrounded by people at different levels of my life where I was exposed to these kind of really foundational ideas around plant and natural healing. So I wanted to share this, and I'd love any feedback. And, you know, I think the last thing I want to say about it is that I don't mean to validate people's criminal behavior and express to them that it was a good thing and it's the same thing as running an apothecary or using your own homegrown herbs. But I think that what I've seen in my students is that they can see themselves in a past life and they can see themselves in a future life. And if I can be a piece of that connection, which I do through, you know, asking a question like today in class, I asked, so what was your first experience with a plant or in a garden? And everyone sat and thought about it. And so many of it was grandparents, you know, but same kind of thing. If we can connect past life experience to potential future life experience, it leads to a desire to learn. And I think that this little curriculum piece has been the only thing that I've really created out of totally nothing because of a student-centered education philosophy. Many of the other things that I work with, the different curriculums, I've adapted from other people or just used directly verbatim. Now is probably a great time to mention the Seed to Supper curriculum that I use, which is from the Oregon State Food Bank. Seed to Supper, 100 pages. It literally is Seed to Supper, and it's created by a food bank, and their goal was to just, you know, reduce the need that their constituents had for them by teaching people everything you need to know about gardening and how to use the food. Great curriculum. You know, I use things like that. I use things from Planting Justice. I use the school garden curriculum book. a great book called Grow Lab. But in trying to translate the herbalism curriculum that I was exposed to, or that I have taken, or that I was trying to seek on the internet, the really incredible books that are filled with knowledge, into something that people who have almost not even an idea of what herbalism could be, I have not found a lot of links, and I've not found a lot of links that bring that other half of people who didn't say they wanted to study herbalism but still showed up to class, that brings them in. And this tool has been evolving to do that, and people seem to really appreciate it. And also, another thing about it, and then I'm going to stop and make some time for questions again, is that a lot of what the students are dealing with through their clinicians is this idea of social acceptability, is that my behavior doesn't fit into a model that the broader society thinks is okay. Maybe everyone around me for the past 5 years thinks my behavior is okay, but that's because I've been living in this. And I hear that a lot from folks, is that they see how something that they did wasn't okay, and they thought it was okay at the time. And this is a way to also show, like, we can go from here to there. We can maybe get stuck somewhere in the middle for a while, but we can keep moving towards, and it doesn't have to be, you know, towards being a clinical herbalist. It can just be moving towards social acceptability so that we don't disrupt the things that we love. You know, I am actually not much of an advocate of assimilating into society, but I understand how important that is for people who are currently incarcerated and in a cycle of that incarceration or drugs. Heavy stuff. So this is a photo, credit to Deb Habib again. I want to leave it here while we, if I can open it up to questions.
There are a couple I'll read off, but I'll leave space if anyone wants to speak up first. One question was, how old are your students, or what ages do you teach?
I've had 18 to 76.
It's very precise.
Well, yeah. I mean, the youngest person I ever met in there, people told me she's only 18. And the 76-year-old man, he very frequently stated his age, you know. He was very into the garden, and there were certain things he wasn't going to do, and everybody knew how old he was. But I would say on average, I will get like a group of 20-year-olds and a group of 40 to 50-year-olds is kind of the way it breaks down usually. You know, some people in their 30s and 40s, but for some reason I get a lot more people under 30 and a lot more people over 50 in the gardening class. I cannot speak to the average age of the people in Franklin County or in Massachusetts detention in any way. But that's what I see in my gardening class. Yeah.
Great. I think this is a question about herbalism for culinary use too, or is this a separate topic that you were going to get into?
Oh, cool. You know, that's a really good point. And I don't know why no one's ever brought it up. It's not even on the list of socially acceptable herbalisms. Thank you. This is like exactly the kind of reason that I wanted to bring this into the class. Whoever brought that up, I really appreciate it. I might put that, I don't know, what do y'all think? Like right below medicinal or maybe above clinical? Yeah, I think culinary herbalism might be even more acceptable, because that's just like putting sage on your steak at Applebee's or something, you know?
It'd be number one. Thank you, Diane.
Number one. Yeah, thanks a lot, Diane. That's great. All right, you're changing the list tonight.
Great. Some more comments about agreeing with you on connecting life experiences and learning the lessons. Great approach, Tony. They also need to know that they're not defined by their worst choices. So again, speaking to your deeper thoughts there. So thank you for all that.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. There's a quote in an office that I share with some re-entry workers that just says, "You are not defined by your worst decisions." And I really appreciate that. Great. Did I not cover anything? Like we were kind of asking for questions about the subjects that I covered, but I imagine that some of you came in here with questions that had nothing to do with what I covered. And since it seems like we've kind of run through the stuff that I did want to bring up, I'd be happy to try to answer other questions. And then I have one more thing to recommend. I see a hand. I'm not sure what that means.
I'm wondering how you see this program growing in the years to come.
Thanks a lot for that question. That's fabulous. So what I want to do is first lay out for you what I want to see, and then I'll lay out for you the reality of what I expect to see. And it is probably now, the reality will be highly influenced by COVID. But what I would like to see is I'd like to see the jail hire 3 more people for the garden program and for it to grow a lot. I'd like to see them hire a full-time farm manager for the food to families program and have that person basically essentially taking people who are classified as minimum security outside of the perimeter fence to work a farm for like a couple, maybe 5 to 6 high production crops that can be used for that program, where then the food goes to those families as well as into the community. I'd like to see a specific person who focuses on like food systems education, like kind of both teaching people about justice and access, as well as getting people jobs in the food system. So kind of a hybridized teacher who uses the education space to get to know the students and help them get specifically food system jobs. There are many people working within vocational reentry at Franklin County Jail, and they do a ton. And I think what I'm aiming at with that role is just to specifically kind of make personal connections between that instructor or staff person and all these different farms and food system jobs in the community that I just can't make those connections with everyone. I've been trying to make connections with many people. And then I know I said so the third thing would be nutrition. I would love to see a full-time nutrition person because it's huge it's the number 2 question or like response when I put out a survey of what do you want to learn about. And if we could even just hire a nutritionist for 10 hours a week to do 4 classes. I'm not a nutritionist. I've taken 1 class in it. I basically present the introduction to that class, and then we talk about people's specific desires when I run a nutrition class. And so if I could really expand the program by my desire, we would hire those people in kind of descending amounts of hours that they would work, and then I would still be able to instruct and coordinate the program and work through development. And then additionally, there's a program called it's like an office for case management for people who get court deferment. I can't remember what it's called right now. And the whole project had to drop off, it was going to kick off shortly after the pandemic started. And so as that program goes forward, I'm hoping to teach gardening classes and some other types of skills within this program where people, instead of going to jail, they take classes and meet with their probation officer in an exterior office. And it's basically court or jail deferment through the court system. So really interested in working with that. And so what I see realistically happening is if there's a vaccine before March, then I see me running the Food to Families project and expanding the gardens again by another a couple of large beds on the inside of the perimeter fence, being able to serve like about 10 families maybe in the growing year of 2021. Have it starting up we're going to be starting community college courses via video. My hope is we usually start the food systems 3-credit course in November. So that's a goal. I can't say it's definitely going to happen, but the pieces are getting put in place. And I would like the students to be able to take the organic farming and 4-season farming classes in person in the spring if there's a vaccine that's accessible to all parties involved. And additionally, I think another big thing for me, a tenet of my focus there, is to just find better pathways to get the food that we grow easily accessible and into the meals that are made inside the kitchen. And that's a whole nother workshop. And the superintendent of the kitchen system there has presented with me and Abra Dresdale, his name is Rob Hicks, at a Farm to Institution New England conference. He's very interested in these like pathways to bringing the organic food. He buys from local distributors when it's possible, and works with the Franklin County Food Processing Center to take food that they're ready to sell in big quantities. And it's just a matter of, an institutional food system working with a small scale hand-powered farm system or garden system. And it's just, we don't quite match, and we're taking years to get to know each other, so to speak. And as I can expand the program, they can adapt a little bit to spend a little more time making it so the food that I present them gets utilized, And so, for example, this week I sent in a 5-gallon bucket of chives, hoping that they could just, someone will stand there and dice them all up, and they will end up in a meatloaf or a mashed potatoes or something like that, where it normally would have just been the same recipe minus the chives, Today I presented a 5-gallon bucket of basil. And this was something I wasn't doing last year, presenting huge quantities of herbs. So, I'd like to increase that direction a lot. And another thing is, when there are people who are able to reside in a minimum security housing unit, one of my goals is to set up a tea station, a self-choice tea station. And I kind of got approval for it at certain levels before the pandemic. So it seems like something that's pretty accessible, and just taking the herbs that we grow, dry, and process, and putting out little fill your own tea bags and a hot water heater next to the microwave. And just another way to get people who grow the food, as well as people who are just there in the living space, to utilize the things that are on site and to create new pathways for self-care. Thanks again for that question. Cool. Well, I've appreciated all of your time.
I got a couple more for you.
Oh, great. Please. Yeah, I'll take some more questions. Thanks.
Unless anyone else.
I see a video just popped up.
One comment was, I hope you get the program growing into other jails. Do you know of any other programs like this in the state?
Great. Thanks for that comment. In the moment, as an individual, I am focusing on this program, and also wanting to be a part of a network that Abra Dresdale helped create with a bunch of other educators. And that's the network of prison and garden educators, prison and jail garden educators, pardon me. And so to kind of go on both sides of that question, as an individual, I'm really interested in doing these kind of workshops on presenting at conferences that aren't about jail gardening, and as a way to get more people to do it. And I'm also working towards making more networks with staff at other facilities to try to see these things build. I am uniquely positioned in that network of prison and jail garden educators as far as I know, the only person who is actually hired and my paycheck is signed by the institution I work in. So everyone else I know works for a nonprofit or doesn't get paid by a nonprofit and does the work as a volunteer, except for the people at the Maine State Penitentiary, I think it is, who have a really strong, thriving garden program. And theirs is a model that I look to. They donate huge amounts of produce, and they have people working on getting their master gardener certificates. I encourage you, if you're interested in that, to look up the Farm to Institution New England Conference, and they have some workshops about their program there. And then, so the New Garden Society is out in Eastern Massachusetts, and they work in more institutions than I can remember. They have like an absolutely phenomenal setup where the folks who work for the organization are able to run regular classes. They're able to create relationships with the security apparatus and the different people and the different bureaucracies. And then they also can bring in teachers from the outside. And so they create gardens on site, and they bring in people from all kind of, I guess, all over the place in the agriculture world. And so it would be easier to probably list the facilities that do have garden programs than that don't in Massachusetts, but I can't really do that. There's probably a listing on the Northeast Network of Prison and Jail Garden Educators. If there's a website for that, there's probably a list. But one thing I will say about that is you can't see all the jails and prisons in Massachusetts on one Google map. You've got to refresh it because the words cover each other up, or whatever Google does. If you try to look up all the jails and prisons in Mass, it is shocking. I mean, I've driven to farmers markets from east to west. I've lived on the Cape. I had no idea how many centers of incarceration there are, including youth facilities. So I would love to see these programs in other places. And what the last thing I want to pull it around to is that my big goal for the next calendar year, or really starting, probably try to publish this at the end of 2021, is to take all my curriculum and make it available online for free in a downloadable kind of Google Docs setting. So that as we convince and create more programs, those teachers don't have to reinvent the wheel and can pick and choose from the work that I've done, and I've been able to benefit from other teachers. There's people in that Northeast network who work in New York City and in upstate New York, in Rhode Island, and I think that's it. Cool. I see a hand.
Yeah, Dale, do you have a question?
Oh, Dale, I think you're muted.
There's a lot of teachers in Massachusetts that are interested in social justice work. And of course, they're having to teach remotely. And so a lot of this material that you're presenting is something that I think they could easily incorporate into class sessions, you know, both in terms of growing, but especially in terms of teaching and learning. And I just want to put it out there that this is a time where something like this could really take off, I think, because of the environment, even though it's a lousy environment, but it's a really changed environment where they could really take advantage of the work you're doing, and also the connections that you've talked about in these other models that are being done out there.
Thanks for sharing that. So can I ask you a follow-up question to that? So you're bringing up like that, well, maybe can you be more specific? Like, do you mean that I should be sharing lessons with some public school teachers?
Exactly.
Cool. Okay.
That's exactly my thought.
Great. Okay.
And you know, I will put it out to my colleagues in the Massachusetts Teachers Association.
Awesome.
That this is potentially one of the resources they might want to be looking at. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thanks a lot. Oh, I get you. Yeah. If I could get that curriculum list in an organized way now, I would have. It was one of my big tasks for the interns that I no longer have helping me. I did have one intern and she was phenomenal. Her name is Sienna Valente Blau. She just moved to Western Mass. And she did a ton of organizing, but I need a whole season to go through, a whole year rather, to go through it all and make sure that it actually makes sense in an order, because that's the thing that matters to me as an educator. Was I was presented with all these lessons, but choosing when in the year to give the lesson, sometimes it made no sense, and sometimes it was perfect, and sometimes it was just luck of the draw. And a lot of times I bring out 3 lessons with me and I just choose one because of based on what feels right in the moment. And so how to translate those, we've decided to set it up by month and even by week. And so I have a system right now where I can go in on Monday and open a drawer and pull out July week 5, and it's a folder that has 2 or 3 lessons, and I try to bring them in, but because of COVID, I missed 4 months. So if Sienna was able to, or if other interns were able to support some of that work in a different way, it could happen now. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the future. If anyone wants to email me about it, I would love to share it with you, and with the kind of caveat that it's really chaotic right now. But yeah, please feel free to reach out. Is my email accessible to all of you right now?
I'll put it in the chat for folks.
Thank you, Christy. Cool. So other questions? We've got a few more minutes.
If I
I've
can
been
ask,
rolling a lot of hose, sorry. Go ahead.
if I can ask, did you get a lot of resistance from prison staff at all in starting this program?
Oh, great question. So one clarifying thing there, I wasn't around at the start of the program. And so the brief story that I know is that Abra Dresdale was able to become a consultant to GCC to help start their farm and food systems program. And I think because of her commitment to educating everyone or to working in prisons and jails, I'm not sure how to exactly frame why she was able to do this, but she started sometime at the beginning of her experience working with that institution, working with the jail. And she was able to write a proposal that the jail hire someone to be a 20-hour-a-week garden program coordinator. And that person was Joshua Friend. And he was a wonderful educator and has moved on to continue to educate. And what they told me about the first few years was that there was a lot of hurdles around the culture of the institution, knowing that there was a garden program. That was like kind of the biggest thing. It was less that there were people who were like, this shouldn't exist. I don't want incarcerated people to garden, and more of like, so where do they go to the garden? Like, how is the right security protocol to make sure that these people who are just out in the dirt, like, come back inside and maintain a secure existence for everyone else who's incarcerated, right? It was more of those kind of like community hurdles. And I think I don't want to speak for all the other people who I've heard who have a similar job to me, but that is something that I've heard consistently. There's not a lot of resistance. Now, as an individual, I have certainly had conversations with some of my coworkers that express to me that they think that the obvious kind of attitude I have about the world isn't the one that they have, right? That our differences in how we see things are so strong that they don't necessarily think that what I'm doing is the best thing for the world. But most of the people I interact with who work in the institution are incredibly supportive in ways that I wouldn't have asked for, in so many ways that I could go into. But I think the big thing that I want to get across there is that, like, the resistance was more bureaucratic and institutional because new things in a highly secured environment are just hard and not interpersonal and not political, if that makes sense. People were not opposed to this in strong ways, but they were opposed to it in ways like, this might make my job a lot harder. Or like, this is a risk for me as an individual that is new because my job involves a lot of risks. And now you're adding a new one, right? So, and then sometimes those people are like really stressed out. And so they react to me in a way that isn't my favorite, but I also get to know them. And that's been, one of the biggest things for me, the biggest, most amazing changes in my life is getting to know all these people on the security side and my students. It's just very different than any other job that I've really had.
And in relation to that, are there any changes in the people in your class that you've noticed? They come in with a certain point of view and leave with another?
Yeah, I mean, everyone is so different, and tremendous change in some people, like just such a, some people I work with have never been in a garden, have never eaten half of the foods that I present. I get a lot of, I don't eat leaves, that's kind of and then like just today, I was like, I have eaten more food in this class that I never ate than ever before. And it's only July, So that's one big thing, is just exposure. And that's, I think, a really important part of being an educator inside of the carceral system, is that, like, another thing I've read on a bulletin board in one of my coworkers' offices, right, is that, like, how can we expect someone to feel like they shouldn't come to jail when their life on the outside is actually worse than the experience of being in jail? Like, it's no longer a threat or a punishment, even though you lose your liberty, right? But on the carnal human sense, if you're safer in jail than you were on the street, it's so hard to imagine not coming back to jail for some people. And exposure to other pieces of the world than that fear-based life is a part of helping people see a pathway out of it. And so I think that's kind of like the nutshell of that question. I mean, more specifically, I've helped people get placed at farms where they live, at farms where they work, I've known people whose plan is post-release to go start a really like niche garden business. Like one man who just left, who's moving back to Eastern Massachusetts. He's really into the idea of building raised beds for the elderly folks in his church community, because there are so many of them and he knows they want a garden, and the primary obstacle is just not being able to bend down. And he's going to work with his minister to like get that project going for free and then see where it goes as a business, for example. And then other folks, their primary takeaway is being in the sun. So that's huge. That's just like on the day-to-day level, somebody who might show up once and says, I haven't been in the sun for X number of months, you know, that's a big change for them. And sometimes I know that that's the only reason they're there. They just want to be outside that day and they may never show up again. And I've created a space for that kind of attitude within the course, within the daily schedule of like, okay, I know you're not really here to learn right now, but you're already here. So let's just find a way that we can be together. And you know, then they kind of maybe want to learn something by the end. They see their peers learning. Thanks for that question.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Tony. This has been very informative, I think inspiring for a lot of people, and people are certainly connecting with what you're doing. So thank you for everything.
Thank you. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, NOFA. Greatly.
I have just a couple of quick follow-up comments. I put a couple of links in the chat. If everyone can take a moment just to fill out a survey and let us know how you enjoyed this session, there's a link to do that there. We also have the virtual vendors. So a lot of the same vendors that you see in our in-person conferences are also coming with us online. So they'd love your support. If you can visit that page on our website, the link is also in the chat. And we have a fundraising raffle going on that supports our scholarship fund. So for folks who aren't able to pay for the cost of registration to this conference and others, we do cover that for them. So our raffle helps us to provide that service. And I think that's all for tonight. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Everyone.
See you next time.